to know it.
Now, how right it was that this was unveiled, it was apocalypsed, while John was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day.
Yeah, you're talking now about the opening scene in Revelation 1. You have the language of imminency. In the opening verses, you have Jesus said, I'm coming quickly. And then the first thing that Jesus does is to pronounce a benediction. He says, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of the prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it read. That isn't a blessing upon the literate and the illiterate.
No, it's a liturgy.
Yes, it's a blessing pronounced upon the lector and the assembly, because Jesus clearly intended the visions he was going to give to John to be read and proclaimed and fulfilled in the Eucharistic liturgy. In verse 10, we read of how John was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Exiled as he was on the island of Patmos, he couldn't celebrate the liturgy with the church there in Asia Minor. So Jesus says, in effect, here I am, and he reveals himself wearing this long white robe, just like the high priest would wear, standing next to the 7 golden lampstands. The menorah that stood in the earthly temple of the earthly Jerusalem has a correspondence up in heaven, where the 7 golden lampstands are right next to Jesus, the heavenly high priest. Jesus says, in effect, to John, come on up to heaven and see how we worship. Write it down, take it back, so that the church on earth will know where it goes and who it's with. Every time they gather on the Lord's Day in the Spirit, angels and saints surround us. The same songs that we sing in the New Covenant liturgy on earth are what the angels and saints are singing in heaven. The same sacrifice, too.
And it begins with the reading of the epistles, these letters from God.
That's right. You have the 7 letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. They're in Revelation 2 and 3. You have the Holy, Holy, Holy in chapter 4. You have the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God in 5. Then you have the altar. You have the book with 7 seals.
Eventually.
Oh, yeah. In fact, the Mass of the early church was divided into 2 parts, the same way the visions of John are. The Apocalypse consists of one half, where all the action revolves around a book that is unsealed and proclaimed. The second half of the Apocalypse concerns the action up in the heavenly altar, where the 7 chalices are mixed and poured. The chalices are said to contain wine, but when they're poured out, they've become like blood.
Right.
The climax of the second half, the climax of the whole book, is the marriage supper of the Lamb, where Christ's bride, the church, is invited to receive this communion with her groom.
Yes.
It's the same in the ancient liturgy. You have the liturgy of the Word, the synaxis, the liturgy of the Eucharist. So when the early church read the vision of John, or they heard it proclaimed by the lector, suddenly they realized this is not just a text. This text becomes living Word through the Eucharistic liturgy. You know, I love to put it this way. We all want to go to heaven. That's a fact. We just don't want to die first. Well, if we can take God at His word, we can discover that we don't have to go. We don't have to die in order to go to heaven. All we've got to do is go to Mass, and heaven is where we are. And the angels and saints are who we're with. Their songs, their sacrifice, their prayers are one and the same as ours. The kingdom has come.
This is what we see in the letter to the Hebrews. It's what we see in the book of Revelation. What was interesting in Letter and Spirit is you show that it's there in other apocalyptic passages in the New Testament. In the vision of Stephen, for example, who was ordained a deacon.
That's right. He sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. He's empowered through this act of martyrdom to forgive those who are executing him. But all he's really doing is simply living out the mystery of the Eucharistic sacrifice.
And even a Jewish commentator like Alan Siegel recognizes in that vision a liturgical vision.
That's right. A vision of the heavenly high priest that is drawn from Psalm 110. Professor Siegel is right. I think what we have to do is discover the Jewish roots of our Catholic rites.
Yes.
And in the process, we'll discover that we go to the heavenly Jerusalem. Israel and the Gentiles gather around the throne of the King of Kings.
And suddenly these books that have been opaque to us are unveiled and illuminated.
That's right. But it's the liturgy that actualizes these truths, so that we're not just looking at texts. We're talking about a living word that comes alive in every Mass.
It sounds good to me. I'll meet you there. Okay?
All right.
And you too. I hope to see you there at Mass and see you here next time we get together on Letter and Spirit.
Veredignum et justum est cum et salutare, nos tibi semper et ubique gratias agere, Domine Sancte Pater Omnipotens Eterne Deus, qui cum unigenitur Filio Tuo et Spiritus Sancto, unus es Deus, unus es Dominus,